Thanks so much, Corey. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. So my name is Eleanor Louson, and I work on the topic of wildlife films, their representation of nature, and filmmaker trustworthiness. And today I'll try to convince you that truth to nature, one of the epistemic virtues from Objectivity, Daston and Gallison's well-known 2007 book, can be fruitfully applied in certain cases where wildlife filmmakers practice natural history artifice, that is, the use of fakery or staging to generate particular behavior for inclusion in a wildlife documentary. In other words, I'm going to try to explain what these two very different images have in common. On the left is an engraving from Linnaeus's atlas featured in Daston and Gallison's Objectivity from page 56. I believe it's a gladiolus sketch. While on the right is David Attenborough being spat on by a zoo cobra in the desert. So very different. This might be a big challenge for me. So here's my plan. I'm going to start with a refresher on the epistemic virtue of truth to nature from Daston and Gallison. So this might be totally new to some of you, and I hope that it's accessible, but I have a feeling that for this kind of community, Daston and Gallison are names that should be a little familiar. Then I'll be introducing natural history artifice with a few examples from the history of the wildlife film genre. Next, I will show how truth to nature's characterization of the sage is especially appropriate for these wildlife filmmakers. And I'll conclude by describing some issues that complicate our drawing of this parallel. Like in many things, the real story is more complicated than the kind of narratives that we tell about them. So, truth to nature. In Daston and Gallison's Objectivity, the authors argue that the modern concept of objectivity emerged as an epistemic virtue within a specific context in the history of science. In other words, objectivity has a history. In the mid-19th century, mechanical objectivity suppressed the potential biases or interventions of subjectivity upon the scientific self. And within this context, subjectivity was thought of as an unreliable guide to both observation and the production of scientific images for atlases. Now, Daston and Gallison contrast mechanical objectivity with the dominant epistemic virtues both before and after this period. It was followed by trained judgment, wherein expertise was permitted to highlight relevant data, and it was preceded by truth to nature, which relied upon the accumulated wisdom and the experienced judgment of certain scientific sages to ensure that images reflected the ideal types of nature and not the idiosyncratic characteristics of any particular specimen or the misguided sensibilities of the artist employed to illustrate such specimens. So the artists weren't meant to draw what they saw in the specimen in front of them, even though they might be quite talented at doing so. According to Daston and Gallison, naturalists operating under truth to nature, in their words, intervened in every stage of the image-making process to correct nature's imperfect specimens. Early in the 18th century, the epistemic virtue of truth to nature came to dominate what they call the observational sciences, which included anatomy, botany, mineralogy, and zoology, among others, within the atlases which offered standardized images of the subject matter of those disciplines. Now, these atlas makers, including Linnaeus and Albinus, were united in the view that what the image represented, according to Daston and Gallison, was not the actual individual specimen before them, but an idealized, perfected, or at least characteristic exemplar of a species or other natural kind. As such, Daston and Gallison described the image produced under truth to nature as a reasoned image. These were not literal representations of the specimen in question, but they represented the applied judgment of the naturalist or sage. Now, the judgment of the sage was the result of a vast amount of experience. It isn't the same thing as the expertise of the expert from the period of trained judgment. Only after exposure to thousands of specimens over a lifetime could the sage properly judge the essential characteristics of a type. Now, the diversity of natural specimens had to be overcome by the scientists' assertive interventions, with the goal, as Daston and Gallison describe it, as revealing the true image of nature. This intervention included governing the artist who produced the image itself, And this relationship involved a kind of four-eyed sight, wherein, according to Daston and Galison, atlas makers had to impose their specialized vision on their artists. The latter could not be relied upon to overcome the temptation of the particular specimen's appearance and see the universal category beneath. Now, the sage, who could see the typical in the specific, was nearly the antithesis of the scientist working under the next epistemic virtue of mechanical objectivity. Daston and Galison stress that the naturalist who pursued truth to nature was exhorted to be active, observing and interpreting nature, monitoring and correcting the artist. Now, in contrast, mechanical objectivity demanded that scientists passively record their observations and to carefully guard against any subjective interventions. You can think of that type of scientist as more like a recording device or a camera. Now, the sage, being required to provide a reasoned judgment, faced a different anxiety with regard to their epistemic virtue. The temptations of the non-typical or even the monstrous specimens which risked being confused with universal types. Such judgment was hard-won over many years, more like decades, and made the sage a reliable guide to nature's underlying types, a guide who knew when to let a specimen speak for itself and when intervention was required. Throughout the history of the wildlife film genre, filmmakers have justified their staging practices by appealing to the underlying reality or scientific truth of their footage. Their arguments, or at least the arguments of these type, generally take one of two forms. Either natural history artifice was used to generate an experience for viewers that is more real than real life, or to produce footage that, for reasons of pragmatism, efficiency, and also I'm going to include cost here, could not have been obtained otherwise. These justifications can be thought of as claims that staging was employed, but for the right reasons. In other words, the end justifies the means. When behaviors are known, or at least believed, to take place in the wild, either through naturalist folklore or scientific knowledge about wildlife, filmmakers tend to claim that generating those real behaviors is justified. The end result is a film containing a realistic, in their conception, realistic scenario that may not have taken place without the intervention of the filmmakers. Examples of this type abound in the history of wildlife filmmaking. The most notorious of these was the lemming suicide scene from Disney's true life adventure film White Wilderness from 1958. Off-screen assistants used a turntable to fling the lemmings off a precipice, while the film's narrator explained how mass lemming suicides, both periodic and instinctive, are mysterious natural phenomena. Now, the popularity of this Oscar-winning film meant that the myth of lemming suicide was perpetuated, although it didn't entirely originate within that film. Now, Roy Disney's apology decades later for fakery in the true life adventures includes his accurately noting that they promoted an awareness of nature. These justifications were often accepted by biologists so long as films were considered to be scientifically accurate. Another example of this type is found in historian Greg Mittman's book, Real Nature, and he talks about ethologist Nico Tinbergen, who made many films for both research and public consumption. And in this episode, Nico Tinbergen's starvation of a lesser black-backed gull chick in order to film the chick pecking at a red spot on the parent's bill for his award-winning film Signals for Survival, which I believe is from 1961 or so. Now, according to Tinbergen's ethological theory, the red spot on the parent's bill should have acted as a sign stimulus for the chick, who would have instinctively produced that pecking behavior in order to be fed. But he wasn't able to get the chicks to cooperate until he starved them for a few days, and then I assume they were pecking at just about anything, and he was able to film some pecking of the red spot. Nature did not cooperate until Tinbergen intervened. In other cases, filmmakers argue that it would be prohibitively expensive or inefficient to capture footage of certain animal behaviors in the wild. In such cases, staging is a shortcut to show what really takes place. Now, a few recent examples involved eminent BBC natural historian Sir David Attenborough from the CBC Fifth Estate documentary Cruel Camera from 2008, in which Bob McEwen interviews Attenborough about his program for the BBC Natural History Unit, Polar Bear: The Arctic Warrior from 1997. For Attenborough, since Arctic polar bear mothers give birth in dens, sheltering their cubs from the cold, the film is scientifically accurate, even though no cubs were filmed in dens in the Arctic. Now, last December, a near-identical controversy erupted surrounding episode 5 of the BBC Natural History Unit's Frozen Planet, produced by Attenborough and featuring footage of, again, newborn polar bears in a zoo enclosure. Now, this time, Attenborough justified his decision as being for what he called the safety of the animal, and he emphasized that, quote, "It's not falsehood, and we don't keep it secret either." More recently, Life in Cold Blood, Attenborough's 2008 series on reptiles, proved controversial once again when it became clear that a desert confrontation between Attenborough and a cobra had been staged. The cobra had been obtained from a zoo and had been brought to the filming location. Responding to the controversy, the Natural History Unit of the BBC admitted that the producers of the 5-part series made extensive use of natural history artifice during its filming. Aiming to enhance this transparency, the Life in Cold Blood website now outlines the series standards for what they call appropriate staging. Wherever possible, animals were filmed in situ in the wild. However, to enable the production team to safely provide otherwise unobtainable new insights into these animals' lives, and most importantly, to safeguard the animals' welfare, other appropriate techniques were also used. These included working with captive or habituated animals in controlled conditions, but always on the advice of scientists familiar with the subjects. The carefully judged use of these techniques has enabled the team to capture revelatory and often previously unseen behavior that couldn't be revealed in any other way. All of the filming techniques used were sensitively employed and followed the published BBC editorial guidelines for natural history filmmaking. That emphasis is added. Attenborough explained to the press how it would be a great misuse of license payers' money, tax, that's equivalent to taxpayers' money, wandering around just hoping that I would come across a spitting cobra, specifying that this kind of staging was only acceptable if no other methods could be used to obtain the same footage. Now, at first glance, there doesn't seem to be much to connect truth to nature, an epistemic virtue influencing the work of atlas makers in the early 18th century, and the excuses made by certain wildlife filmmakers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries when they've been caught fabricating animal behavior. They both, however, involve the representation of natural objects, the former in atlases designed for use by scientific practitioners, and the latter in films intended for public and educational viewing by certainly non-specialists. As well, they both involve certain interventions upon particular natural circumstances by scientific figures. These parallel intervening practices make truth to nature, I believe, especially germane to research focusing on wildlife films. As an analytic tool, Truth to Nature offers us new insights into these cases of wildlife filmmakers justifying their staging practices, in that they aim to showcase a view of nature that is, in their estimation, more real than that accessible without their interventions. Wildlife filmmakers possess some of the same characteristics of the Truth to Nature sage, and they justify some of their interventions to the same end. Regardless of these similarities, however, there are reasons to be cautious about applying this tool uncritically, since wildlife filmmaking's commercial pressures and lack of transparency with regard to staging practices make it not so easy to map onto Daston and Gallison's account. How are wildlife filmmakers like Truth to Nature sages? In many ways, the similarities are striking. Some wildlife filmmakers have had long and distinguished careers as natural historians and have accumulated a great deal of experience working with wildlife. Sir David Attenborough exemplifies this persona as the wise, trusted voice of the BBC's Natural History Unit and their blue chip documentaries. Attenborough's Life series for the BBC Natural History Unit, and there are multiple series going back a few decades, each document different branches of the living world. Collectively, they practically make up a filmed atlas of the Earth's diverse plants and animals, and sometimes it's described that way in the publicity for these series. Nico Tinbergen, the Nobel Prize-winning ethologist, is also experienced with regard to the species he studied so carefully in his own research on animal behavior for the films that he made. The BBC Natural History Unit's guidelines reinforce the wisdom of their filmmakers, referring, as we saw in the previous quote, to scientists familiar with their subjects, as well as their carefully judged and sensitively employed techniques. The wildlife filmmakers' relevant and lengthy experience has apparently granted them the ability to judge whether interventions are warranted. Now, the interventions made by wildlife filmmakers are especially relevant for truth to nature. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, such interventions can be interpreted as falling under this epistemic virtue. The specimen being filmed just needed a little coaxing to demonstrate what is essential for its species. For Tinbergen to be able to demonstrate gull-chick instincts on film, he needed to intervene when the chicks would not peck at their parents' sign stimulus. In such cases, and keeping in mind this is a charitable interpretation, these filmmakers must intervene for the sake of truth to nature, producing filmable behavior characteristic of that species. Their justifications about showing real behaviors interpreted in this fashion are in line with the motivations of Daston and Gallison's 18th century natural historians. Now, of course, the above charitable rationalizations do not take into account the important differences between modern filmmakers and Enlightenment atlas makers. The former, working in a highly commercial context, feel pressure to capture as spectacular footage as possible and are tempted to cut corners where they can. When staging practices are justified as being for the sake of cost or efficiency, as in Attenborough's 2008 Cobra controversy, it becomes easier to be skeptical about the imputation of truth to nature motives. And the fact that all of the public justifications of staging practices take place after the accusations of fakery have already been made, and never unprompted, at least never that I've experienced in my research on this topic, suggest at least a transparency gap between filmmakers and atlas makers. Now, Daston and Gallison refuse to be cynical in their characterization of truth to nature atlas makers. They say that the naturalists and illustrators of the 18th and early 19th centuries were not, however, self-deceived or hypocritical, preaching fidelity to nature while practicing manipulation in the service of preconceived notions. They deemed the crafting, they would have called it perfecting, of images to be their scientific duty rather than a guilty distortion, and they practiced it openly. So they are certainly on the charitable end of the spectrum. Now, when wildlife filmmakers are found guilty of having faked nature, it is often under precisely the conditions here that Daston and Gallison rule out in this quote. The Disney True Life Adventures claimed that they were completely authentic, unstaged, and unrehearsed, and this was patently false. Their natural history artifice was not practiced openly. Attenborough's response to the more recent accusations of staging that, quote, "we don't keep it secret," is worrisome at best. The zoo where the polar bear cubs were filmed is listed on the program's website and credits, but is not mentioned during the show, as we saw in the previous interview. In general, viewers are in the dark until accusations of staging are made, at which point credits on websites become indicators of transparency that the filmmaker can point to and say, yes, we did tell you. For cases like these, the epistemic virtue of truth to nature does not apply straightforwardly because wildlife films are not pure science. If transparency risks the bottom line, they just leave it out. In addition, the sage is not the only persona self-fashioned by wildlife filmmakers. The earliest wildlife films were hunting travelogues, and you can see on the left, that's ex-President Roosevelt on his safari in Africa, where he went on safari and hunted many species that are now, we don't hunt them anymore because they've been overhunted, showcasing the sportsmanship and prowess of the filmmaker. This emphasis on physicality, as well as the patience and endurance required to survive dangerous encounters in the wild, have persisted in tropes of a rugged and active filmmaker persona, such as Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter on the right. However, I think these still contain elements of truth to nature's sage, including the emphasis on their wealth of experience in the wild, their knowledge of species' typical traits and behavior, and judgment about the dangers of the wilderness. The epistemic virtue of truth to nature is useful in fleshing out filmmakers' justificatory strategies that point to enhancing the realism or scientific accuracy of their footage. Daston and Gallison's account in Objectivity of Truth to Nature's sage, intervening in order to promote the essential and exclude the accidental in their production of images of nature, resonates with these very public personas of wildlife filmmakers. The latter's justification for natural history artifice argue that their interventions make visible a more real image of nature, one that overcomes nature's reluctance to show the essential of a species in the behavior of a single specimen. Wildlife filmmakers claim to have the requisite judgment, born from their lengthy experience in the field, to intervene appropriately in order to show wildlife as it really is and to avoid the limitations of wildlife as it happened to be in front of the camera. Atlas makers under Truth to Nature, according to Daston and Gallison, worked towards the same goal. This common motivation to show the universal in the individual suggests that wildlife filmmakers share in the epistemic virtue of Truth to Nature insofar as we can take them at their word. This, however, I think is the most challenging aspect of applying this analytic tool, because wildlife films, unlike atlases, are meant for mostly public consumption, even though it's public educational consumption. And wildlife filmmakers are under commercial pressure both to offer increasingly spectacular footage of nature as efficiently as possible and to limit the transparency of their methods, at least until staging practices become publicly known. These issues can certainly be argued to interfere with Truth to Nature's force in their intervening choices, but this complexity should not diminish the pertinence of the epistemic virtue with regard to wildlife filmmaking. Thanks very much.